I just want to point out that I never suggested that it pro-class anybody the election. I was just using the 92 and 96 elections as a historical model of what a map with a strong third-party candidate might look like. Whether it was deciding or not, I do think it is well understood that a substantial number of Southern voters didn't like voting for a northeastern liberal, which is a statement about being aligned with old money, not a statement about the left-right axis. Perot is a populist, and populists are the opposite of establishment liberals. So, George Bush the Elder was an establishment liberal, whereas Perot was maybe more liberal, but not establishment, and therefore not liberal, and therefore populist. Confused? I've argued in the past that liberal is probably the most complicated word in the English language. You need to always put it in context, and you need to be careful that you don't compare the word through different contexts. So if I say liberal and you say liberal and we're using them in completely different ways, it can get very confusing, right? I've been actually in arguments where people are calling each other liberals, and they're both using it as pejoratives, and they're both right in the way they're using it, but they're both using it in completely different contexts. And they're both yelling that each other are liberals, and I'm not convinced that Johnson is fading, and it's kind of important where he's fading to. She doesn't need Georgia. She doesn't need North Carolina either, really. But if she does win those states, and Johnson gets 10% or 12% or 14% in those states, right? You might get 6% nationally, but 13% in South Carolina. It's going to be hard to argue against Johnson being the reason. Even if Johnson does poll better with Democrats overall. See, how Johnson polls nationally is fine and everything, but if he's pulling 80% of support from Democrats in Oregon and 80% of his support from Republicans in North Carolina, and it's North Carolina that swings, then it's the local numbers that are meaningful. Okay, so don't throw national numbers at me with Johnson and say, look, Johnson is taking more of Democrats nationally, so therefore he must be taking more of Democrats on the East Coast. That doesn't work. And I think it's pretty obvious if you look at it. How is Clinton winning in Georgia if Johnson is not taking votes away from Republicans? Again, Trump doesn't have a map here. It's like he doesn't have a path. We could still get a massive attack, mind you, and then everything erupts, but I think the only chance he has right now is to split New Mexico and then hold every state he could possibly hold, which is less than 270, unless he wins New Mexico. And the reason is that Virginia is not a swing state this election. But then again, if Virginia was a swing state, Johnson's numbers may have turned out to be deciding. And let us think about this carefully, because perhaps Virginia would be more competitive if Johnson wasn't running. We say Virginia is not a swing state. We look at the numbers. Maybe the reason it's not a swing state is because Johnson is running. That's a thought, that's not a declaration. But that is the region where you expect Johnson to do better with conservatives. Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. You expect Johnson to do much better with conservatives in that region. Even if you expect Johnson to do better with liberals. And see, it's almost like Johnson's an empty box, right? He shouldn't be. There's enough data out there that people should be able to figure this out. But if you get your information entirely from mainstream media, then Johnson is pretty much a blank box, right? You have to actually go on the internet and figure that out yourself, right? If you're just getting it from CNN, then Johnson is just nothing, right? He's just like the alternative. And if you're in a place that tends to lean, if you're in a conservative state where you have a conservative culture and you don't like the Republicans because they're not conservative enough, then, there's certainly some logic to it. He was a conservative governor, right? But if you're a liberal and you're in a liberal state, then he's a liberal because you don't like you don't think the Democrats are liberal enough. It's just, on this particular election, and it was the case in 92 and 96 as well, but in this particular election, there's nowhere that leans liberal that's going to elect Trump on a split. But there are places that lean conservative that very well may elect Clinton on the split. Like I say, it might not be decisive, right? If she does win Georgia and she does win North Carolina and she does win South Carolina, that doesn't mean like that's not what's going to win her the election. But nonetheless, it might happen, right? So if Johnson does come down, does that mean Virginia does get more competitive? And if it does, ah, then the whole thing unravels, right? I'm holding by my analysis. It's just that you want to flip the swing states on an axis of the Appalachians. Okay, you can go back, and I'm not even going to bother looking at the link, but it was a few weeks ago. In 92 and 96, it was the states in the Ohio Valley that were in play, um, because that's where the swing was, right? Now it's the states on the coast, right? So Bill Clinton barely won Tennessee, barely won Kentucky. You think Ross Perot didn't have anything to do with that? He would have won anyways, but and this time around, Clinton might barely win North and South and Carolina and Georgia, and tell me that Johnson doesn't have anything to do with that. I think if you look carefully, you're going to see that he has a lot to do with that, right? So it might not seem decisive, broadly speaking, but she does need at least Virginia, right? And that said, you could interchange any one of them, right? If Johnson collapses and that means that she does somehow lose Virginia, then she needs North Carolina instead, and etc. And I think that's actually more important to Clinton than the region was to her husband in the 90s. But like I say, I was just building on the precedent historically. I'm not suggesting that Johnson is going to lead to Clinton, because even if she does lose Virginia, if she wins Ohio, or she wins Florida, Clinton has a lot of different ways she could win. And whatever way it is, it's probably not going to come directly down to Johnson unless, like I say, Trump wins every state he could possibly win. And you get something like a split in New Mexico, or you get like Johnson fades in Virginia or something funny like that. Right now, it's probably not the thing. Okay? And I'm actually, I got myself thinking about this, and I decided I should update that point that I had before. Okay, I'm going to be explicit about it. I said previously that depending on how you interpolate the undecideds, you're looking either at Johnson's strength pushing a repeat of 92 or 96 on the map. Will undecideds distribute? Will Johnson take a late run? If Johnson were to take a late run, it would probably look more like 1992. But if Johnson kind of fades a little bit or kind of stays where he is, then you're looking more at like 1996. I see no evidence that Johnson is going to take a late run. Okay? And I see no evidence that undecideds are leaning one way or another. It could be that everybody that says undecided means Johnson. I don't see any evidence of that. So I'm willing to fall back on the idea that they'll distribute, roughly. This is kind of the null hypothesis, right? We need to assume they'll distribute unless we can come up with a better idea. And there is no better idea, so we have to kind of fall back on that, right? If you can come up with a better idea, I'll take it, but right now I don't see one. Now what that suggests is that we're looking at 1996 rather than 1992. And then at the end of the day, Clinton may be flirting with around 50%. Okay? 1996 numbers were Clinton at 49, Dole at 41, Perot at 8. And there's your map. It's relatively different, actually. Today we're looking at, this is the most recent Atlantic poll, Clinton around 42, Trump around 35, third parties mostly Johnson around 9, and then undecided is around 14. Undecided polling higher than Johnson. In fact, undecided polling higher than Johnson and third parties combined. Which scales to Clinton 49, Trump 42, and third parties 11. What I'm doing there is I'm saying, okay, if there's 14% undecided, then 84% decided, we're going to distribute, so we'll just forget about it. 42 over 84 is 49, 35 over 84 is 42, and 9 over 84 is 11. I'm just reducing the size. Assuming that undecided will distribute properly, which means that the same amount, the amount that goes from undecided to the declared candidates will be proportional to the amount that already exists with the declared candidates. If you didn't understand that, that's fine. Just understand this is normal. Statisticians do this all the time. Pollsters do this all the time. I'm being a little bit unusual in kind of pulling back from that and saying, wait a second. You really should have a justification for doing that. Or at the very least, you should ensure that there's not a justification for not doing that, right? That there's not a reason that you shouldn't do that. In Canada, in the last election, there was a big reason you shouldn't have done that, which was because we had lots of data that told us that undecideds were like, in the Canadian election, when somebody said undecided, that means that they hadn't decided between the Liberals and the NDP. Right? None of the undecideds were going to vote Conservative. And we had tons of data that said that. So you came up with these polls, and they did distribute, and they were totally wrong. Because, I mean, the undecideds were very large, too, right? We ended up with like 25-30% undecided, and they tried to distribute them to the Conservatives, even though they told us that they weren't going to vote for the Conservatives. And at the end of the day, what ended up happening was that all of the undecideds went to the Liberals, and the Conservatives just ended up flat, like at 30. But if you try to distribute them, you'd end up with the Conservatives at 39-40%, because they had a higher level of decided support. And this is what I'm saying here. If the data told us that undecideds were disproportionately leaning towards Trump, then what I'm doing right now in distributing it would be perilous. And if you just add 10% of the undecided to Trump, he wins. Or at least he wins the popular vote. There's no evidence of that. We could say that, if we had evidence that suggests that people that tell us that are undecided are really going to vote for Jill Stein, then all of a sudden, the third party jumps up to 23, and it looks like 1992 when Ross Perot ran at almost 20%. It's just that we don't have any evidence like that. I wish we had some evidence. I don't even care what the evidence. It's not an issue of wanting the evidence to say something. It's just like I wish there was some evidence so that I didn't have to distribute, because I don't want to distribute. But this is what we got, okay? And at this point, we're late enough in. There's no reason to think it won't. Or to rephrase that, there's no reason to think that we'll have evidence to suggest that we can come up with a better assumption. That said, we could end up very surprised. Right? We could learn that all of the undecideds are male chauvinists that refuse to say they'll vote for Clinton on the phone, but will actually do it when they get in the booth. We don't know. It could be any crazy thing, right? All we know is that there's a good chunk of people that aren't telling us what they want. They could not vote. They could stay home, in which case it would distribute. That's enough to swing the election, right? There's just no data at this point to suggest that it won't come out in the wash. And like I said, that's a lot closer to 96 than 92. So let's look at the map for 1996. Well, first thing that jumps up obviously is that Clinton's not going to win Arkansas, which I think she should have. Should have campaigned in Arkansas. She's not going to win Louisiana, not going to win Tennessee, not going to win Kentucky, not going to win West Virginia. Although I think that you might be surprised. It might get closer. This little area around here might be closer than you think. The polling's been kind of... Well, these are not states that are considered in play. But I've seen polls, and they're not every poll. Some of the polls are more like what the demographics might argue. But I've seen polls that put her within a few points in Missouri, polls that put her within a few points in Kentucky. These are not the average polls, but I've been clear. I don't like taking averages. I don't like aggregates. I'm not predicting that she's going to win any of those states, not even Missouri anymore. At one point I thought she would probably pull out and win in Missouri. I'm not predicting any of that at this point. I'm just saying that don't be surprised if it's closer. Same thing in Arizona. Don't be surprised. I'm not saying she's going to win Arizona, but don't be surprised if she does. But I mean, that said, I think that I should have let... Okay. With Arizona, I'm saying don't be surprised if she wins Arizona. I'm not saying she will, but don't be surprised if she does. With Kentucky, Tennessee, um, I mean, what West Virginia is, Trump will win West Virginia by a huge amount. But Kentucky, Tennessee, what I'm saying, like, Trump will win Kentucky and Tennessee almost certainly. But don't be surprised if at the end there's a surge and you're shocked and he wins, but he wins by 2 points. Or he wins by 3 points. Like, don't be surprised if that happens in Kentucky and Tennessee. But nonetheless, that looks pretty different, doesn't it? The flip side of that is that she's almost certainly going to win Virginia. She's in a strong position in North Carolina, and she's challenging in Georgia. And there's even some polls that say something maybe out of South Carolina. So it seems like these states here aren't really competitive this time, but these states here are. So it's like the election has flipped over an axis that you could draw through the Appalachian Mountains. Is that a coincidence? I think that maybe if you were to look into it, you'd see that it's not a coincidence. That a lot of, that this area here, as well as this area up here as well, have gone through rapid deindustrialization. The cities are shrinking. People are moving away. And where are they moving? They're moving here. Right? There's also been a lot of migration from up here down to here. But there's been migration moving that way as well. So this area is going through depopulation, and specifically depopulation in the urban regions. It's the same thing in Missouri, right? Whereas this area is going through massive population growth. You're seeing a lot more educated people over here. You're seeing less educated people here because the educated people are moving away. And so that makes sense. The people that lived here that would have voted for the Democrats 20 years ago don't live here anymore. Now they live over here. And what's left over this space is kind of similar to what existed here 20 years ago. So, your old racist white Dixies are in Kentucky and Tennessee now. And your more a forward-thinking. I mean, I don't want to use these. How can I put this? Well, I guess Jimmy Carter was from Georgia, wasn't he? Right? But it's your more progressive Democrats have crossed the Appalachians and they're here now, right? Which is not to suggest that these are raving liberals. These are going to be conservative Democrats still, right? But there's all kinds of reasons why they're going to lean towards the party of the urban educated elite and kind of try to stay away from the party of the uneducated, rural buffoons, right? You can imagine what it's like to live in that region, right? And to see the class difference that dramatically. And it's not just class in terms of wealth. There's lots of poor Democrats, poor black Democrats, but that class difference in terms of intelligence, right? So in '92, the swing was on the Ohio Valley side of the Appalachians up here. From West Virginia down to Louisiana, and Arkansas, Louisiana may have been something else, right? But nonetheless, there was a swing there. And today the swing is on the East Coast from Virginia down to Georgia, and it's pretty much the same swing, it's moved, right? It's the same phenomenon. That's what I'm getting at. It's just it's switched. And then they're the ones with the black lines that are swing states but independent. I got Arizona, Missouri, Iowa, Ohio, and I should have included Florida and Colorado, but they were outside of my thinking here. Which is because nowadays Colorado is pretty solidly blue, and I think the importance of Florida is overstated, to be honest with you. There's lots of ways that Clinton can win without Florida, and there's lots of ways that Trump can lose with Florida. I don't think Florida is really the key here. And I mean, it's also because it's not. Florida is its own thing, right? Like you can be competitive with this entire swath of, and then you get, what is that, 1326. Well, it's more electoral. I've got a black line there through North Carolina, but if you can take that whole swath, then you get more electoral votes than Florida, right? It just seems also more like a. I think the swinging this area is more like long-term kind of thing, right? Whereas Florida is always, you win Florida and then you got to win Florida again. You know, Florida is always transient. You can never rely on Florida, right? So I want to be clear what the differences are. Polling in Tennessee and Kentucky suggests that Clinton is not that far behind. Like I say, she's probably not going to. She's not likely to win the states, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer than you expect. And in 1996, those coastal southern states were not big wins for Dole either. Okay, Dole won those states, but he did not win them by large margins. In fact, Clinton won Georgia in '92. The analogy holds well when you flip it over. Bill barely won Kentucky, he barely won Tennessee, and in the end, Clinton may barely win North Carolina, and barely win Georgia, and maybe even barely win South Carolina, right? Although I'm trying to avoid discussing South Carolina because that would be insane to think that the Democrats could win in South Carolina. And Gore was the conservative VP from Tennessee, just as Kane is the conservative VP from Virginia, right? You can flip it right over there. This is where the demographic differences over the last 20 years mean something. The coasts are more educated and less rural. The valley is less educated and more rural. Mississippi and Alabama remain fucked. However, these guys here are hopeless. Although Clinton will do well in specific counties that aren't absurdly racist or that have black people in them. So it's mostly counties that have black people in them because those places are absurdly racist, right? But it's a flip over the axis. My point is that you're looking at 92, not 96, okay? I was saying the whole time, like, what is this? Is this 92 or 96? This is 90. Sorry, that's an error. Let's fix that. I got that backwards. My point is that you're looking at 96, not 92. I think that has clarified itself. You just need to make that demographic adjustment. Don't be surprised if she wins Arizona, and I'm pointing out that I missed Colorado altogether, which is seldom. Okay, so this is, I had said something like this before. Are we looking at 92 or 96? I think it's 96, and I'm trying to explain what we see here. It may sound like I'm jumping through hoops, mental gymnastics, all this kind of thing. But what I tried to explain there is that you need to look at this area as a region, right? I think it's really perilous to look at national polling, but I also think it's very instructive to look at regional polling, right? So you have the Northeast, you have the Southeast, you have, the West. I think maybe the Midwest is a little bit. You've got the Great Lakes, though, for sure, right? And then you've got the mountain regions, right? And these are areas. And while you may see things kind of shift in between the region, I think that when you see patterns erupt, those patterns are going to apply to the region more broadly, right? So what I'm saying really is that if you were to take the data not for these specific states, but for this broad region, which I'm going to call the Southeast, which is like West Virginia, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, I'm going to take Florida out, right? And you take that kind of region there, right? And in fact, I'm even going to take our Arkansas and Louisiana out, right? So it's east of the Mississippi, south of the Ohio, and splits up around the Virginia line, right? That area, if you were to take, and not including Florida, if you were to take the demographics in that region in 1996, right? Broad demographic data in 1996 across the whole region, and you were to fit it to what we have today with the same basic breakdown of, Clinton around 35. Well, actually, no, it's going to be Clinton around 49, Trump around 41, and Johnson around 8 or 9, 10, 11. I think you're going to see broad similarities. The difference is where those people live, right? And nowadays, more people that are likely to vote for Democrats live in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia. Back then it was Kentucky, Tennessee, right? I can go on about this and try to make what I'm saying a little bit more clear forever. I think what I've said is about as clear as it's going to be, so I'm just going to bail.